this time we commence the joint meeting between the Ukiah Valley Sanitation District and the Ukiah City Council. Roll call and pledge of allegiance. At this time, I ask the district to call roll.
Okay, it would be
Clerk.
Chair Whiff,
here.
Vice Chair Marshall,
Present.
Director Horsley. Here. Director Baucom,
Here.
Director McNairland. Present.
And for the City of Ukiah,
Councilmember Mulherin. Here. Brown.
Here.
Scalmanini.
Here.
Vice Mayor Roscoe.
Here.
Mayor Crane.
present. And would you be kind enough to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, Mr. Report? Thank you. You want to read audience comments, or do you want me to?
Go.
Audience comments on non-agenda items. If you wish to speak on a matter that is not on this agenda, you may do so at this time. In order for everyone to be heard, please limit your comments to 3 minutes per person and not more than 10 minutes per subject. The Brown Act regulations do not allow action to be taken on audience comments in which the subject is not listed on the agenda. New business, presentation of, you want to do that one?
Sure. New business, the presentation of and preliminary read, review, and discussion of the draft administrative report on wastewater rate analysis for the City of Ukiah and the Ukiah Valley Sanitation District, and consideration of wastewater rates for the City of Ukiah, and I would imagine the Ukiah Valley Sanitation District also.
So just for clarification, that the agendas, the district had this item listed only as discussion. The City of Ukiah does have it listed for potential action. So there's two different agendas, one for each meeting.
Okay. So the presenter would be Dan Buffalo, the Finance Director.
I would refer to our consultants, Mark Hildebrand and Bob Reed, to guide us through this wonderful journey that we're about to go on.
Great.
Good evening. Thanks for having us. My name is Mark Hildebrand, I'm a Hildebrand Consultant, and I'm here with Bob Reed of the Reed Group. And we authored a joint sewer rate study for the city and the district. And we're here tonight to present our recommendations based on that study. The study was largely driven by the operating agreement, which was signed by the city and the districts last year. And so I'll be going over some of the principles of that operating agreement and then taking you through the analysis that we did and the conclusions that we came to. So, the agenda for my presentation is first we'll talk a bit about the study and what we did and the scope of our work. Then we'll look at the operating agreement itself, some of the high-level elements of the operating agreement as they relate to the study and the analysis that we did. We'll talk about the proposed operating cost allocation, because part of the study was to look at how operating costs should be allocated. Then we'll look at the financial plans for both the city and the district. They both have their own individual financial plans based on their individual financial requirements. Then we'll look at the cost, service, and rate design, which is starting to look at the mechanics of what the rates should look like for each of the district and the city, and then talk about next steps. So looking at the study at a high level, and this, is that better? Okay. Looking at the study at a high level, there were 4 principal steps that were followed. This sort of mimics what I just talked about in the agenda. But the first step was to look at the cost allocation of operating costs primarily, and also capital costs between the city and the district as required by the operating agreement. The next step, once we understood how the costs would be allocated, we then looked at the what we call the revenue requirements, which is also called the financial plan. And so that's when you look at all the money going into a utility and all the money coming out. So the money coming in would be primarily rate revenue from your ratepayers, but there's also miscellaneous sources of revenue. And then the money going out would be the operating expenses, the capital expenses, debt service, and developing a financial plan around that so that you understand how much your rates need to be in the future, and making some recommendations about any increases or adjustments to that rate revenue for the future. It also looks at the potential for issuing debt to finance capital projects. Cost of service is once you understand how much revenue you need to collect for a utility. Cost of service is identifying from whom you're going to collect that revenue. So whether it's commercial customers, residential customers, high-strength customers. The cost of service is the cornerstone of Proposition 218, which is the California law that dictates how utilities can charge for services. And it basically requires that you can't charge rates that, you have to charge rates that reflect the cost to provide service. And the last step is the rate design. So once you know how much you want to collect from each of your individual customer classes, the rate design determines how you're going to collect it. So how much of that revenue is going to come from a fixed portion of the bill, how much of it's going to come from the volumetric portion. So in other words, how much water is used and how much sewage is estimated to be produced. And from that, you can recommend a specific rate structure. So first, cost allocation. First, I wanted to highlight some elements of the operating agreement. So again, the operating agreement was signed by the city and the district last year, and it talks on a number of different topics, one of which was a requirement that this rate study, be completed in order to allocate costs between the city and the district in a fair and equitable way, and develop rates that match the requirements for both the city and the district. So the first point is that the treatment and collection costs are to be proportioned between the city and the district based on the amount of water consumption and relative sewage strength coming from the city and the district respectively. So we had to take the data available and try to determine how much wastewater from the city and from the district are being contributed to the treatment plant respectively, and the strength of that wastewater from the two different sources. And we were able to do that by looking at a detailed list of all the customers and their water consumption. The other portion of the operating agreement that I'll highlight here is that there are 3 different functions that were supposed to be characterized separately. There is the billing and collection costs, which should be allocated based on the number of accounts that each of the agencies has. The operating O&M costs, and then the O&M of the collection system, the operation of the collection system, and the operation of the treatment plant. So those were the 3 major components that we looked at separately in terms of allocating the costs. Down here, the footnote, I do want to point out that throughout this study, we use a term that we call ESSSU, which is your equivalent sewer service strength units. It's similar to a term that's used in the operating agreement, which is ESSU, which stands for equivalent sewer service unit. We wanted to use this term because it's a pretty standard industry term. We wanted to differentiate it because the way we define it for the purpose of the study is just a little bit different than the way that it's defined in the operating agreement. We couldn't make use of the specific definition of ESSU from the operating agreement because it talks about dwelling units within each account, and we didn't have access to that data of how many dwelling units were for each different account, and it's not typical for a rate study to look at that type of thing. So we adopted a similar but different metric for measuring sewage being produced by accounts. Some more principles on the operating agreement in terms of cost allocation. The operating and maintenance costs were based and proportionate to the ESSSU metric that I just mentioned, which is essentially the equivalent of a single-family home, how much sewage a single-family home produces. So the amount of sewage and the strength of that sewage. And the way that we determine that is look at typical water usage during the winter. So during the months of January to March, the general assumption is that that's predominantly indoor water use, that you're not irrigating outside. So the water that's used by the average single-family home during those months is assumed to be the equivalent, is the amount of sewage that's produced year-round from single-family homes. And then there's also industry measures of what's expected from domestic wastewater strength. And so we applied those two numbers to determine what one ESSU was. Capital costs were generally allocated in the same way as O&M costs. So we essentially quantified all the ESSSUs for the district and all those for the city and the district, and looked at the percent relative number of ESSUs and allocated costs that way. We did the same thing for capital. The exception being that there are certain capital projects that are such that they specifically benefit either the district or the city. So while in general capital projects are allocated along that same rationale, each individual project is negotiated individually, and in some cases it's 100% city or district, and we accounted for that. The results for the cost allocation is that if you look at the operating agreement, it says 53% city, 47% district. That's the default allocation that was signed at the time. They needed a number. They used best available data at the time, and that was the number that was determined. And we recalculated. One of the purposes of the study was to validate that number, or to recalculate it using the data that we had available to us, and we've done that. We'll talk about that on slide 8. The existing debt was allocated 52% city, 48% district, again, based on the operating agreement and the best available information. The allocation, how they came up with this 52-48, is a little bit complicated. There's two different parts to that debt, and so we're going to be talking a lot about this debt because it's a very large debt issue that was issued back in 2006. It's a significant part of both the city and the district's budget every year, and so the allocation of these costs is a big deal. It's important that we get it right. That debt is broken into two parts. 25.8% of that debt is called the capacity portion. So it's basically related to the capacity of the plant that it helped fund. And that portion of the debt was split 35% city, 65% district. The remaining 74.2% of the debt is related to the upgrade and rehabilitation portion of the plant. So that's basically fixing up the plant, rehabilitating portions of the plant that were aging. And that is split on this ESSSU split. So this portion is fixed, 35-65 going forward. It will remain the same unless something changes. Whereas the ESSSU split is actually a dynamic number that will change over time depending on how many accounts and how much water is being used in the two different service areas. So we did calculate this number as we recalculated what this split would be. Again, the default is 53-47, and we recalculated it going forward. And just as a spoiler, what we're looking at is that the district is growing at a faster rate than the city is, or at least we assumed that it will be. And so the ESSSU split will slowly increase for the district over time is our expectation. Although that will be validated. You know, if the growth happens, then that will be reflected in the future. If it doesn't happen, then it won't. So that's not something that we're locked into, that assumption. Any new debt we assumed would be split, again, based on the ESSSU split or otherwise negotiated depending on what the debt is issued for. Some methodology highlights from the study is that we did use water usage data from the city of Ukiah, from Millview, from Willows, and Regina. And so the fact that the water usage data came from so many different sources is a complicating factor for rate consultants, as we're trying to acquire this data and make sure that it's paired with the correct city and district accounts. It does create a little bit of complications, but we did get through that. Thank you for your patience. And we did find a material difference in the water usage patterns from one year to the next. So we essentially, we saw that from one year to the next, there was big drops and big increases in the water usage, and we could only assume that that's what actually happened, but our intuition told us in part that that might have something to do with the billing data, potentially being, there's potentials for error when you receive data from 4 different sources. So in the end, I think we got to a comfortable spot with the data, but it took us a while to make sure that we were comfortable with it, but we did get there. The ESSSUs that we calculated for the city and district, for residential, it's based on the number of dwelling units. So again, a single residence is assumed to be a single residence, so that counts as 1 ESSU, regardless of the address or the size of that residence. For commercial, what we did is we categorized that commercial account as either low, moderate, medium, or high. That's based on the existing rate structures that both the city and the district have in place now. It assumes certain sewer strengths for different types of activities. A high strength category would be restaurants, for example, because they put a lot of food waste down, and so it's a high strength sewage that's more expensive to treat. And then what we did is we looked at those commercial, at the winter water use for those commercial accounts and compared that to a single family home. So if they use the same, if it was a low commercial and they use the same amount of water as a typical residential account, then that would be counted as 1 ESSU. If it had a higher strength or if it had higher water usage, the ESSU assignment would be higher. And so we calculated all those and enumerated all the ESSUs for both the city and the district. In the end of the day, when we looked at all the commercial accounts, the strength profile, so in other words, the number of low commercial and high commercial and medium commercial, were very similar between the city and the district. And so ultimately that made the analysis easier because there wasn't a large disparity in terms of the type of sewage that's being, in fact, the difference in the strength was almost negligible between the city and the district. Go ahead.
I read though in this that the city was no longer billing mobile home parks and multi-family units, apartments as commercial. And those would be as residential now, correct? So was that accounted for? How did you account for that?
So the residential or the mobile homes were treated as residential units. So one mobile home was considered 1 ESSSU. Yeah.
And then you took into account how many individual apartments were in an apartment complex.
Correct.
And that counted as 1
Yes.
ESSSU.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, and what you're pointing out is that current billing practices are treating those accounts as commercial right now. That didn't affect our analysis at all. That was just pointing out current practices and what's being changed. So the city had been in the practice of treating those accounts as commercial because of the way that they could measure their wastewater and whatnot. But that didn't affect our recommendations.
My question, it was just like, because you said you found them pretty comparable, but
Right.
then when you take those out and move those to residential, is it still pretty comparable?
Yeah. Correct. So here are some high-level numbers that came from the analysis. First, I wanted to point out here are the strength factors. We talked about the low, moderate, medium, and high different designations for commercial. The low commercial would be the same as residential. So when we talk about BOD, this is biochemical oxygen demand. It's a chemical measurement of how much oxygen is required in order to break down material. It's basically a measure of energy that's needed for degrading organic matter. And this drives your energy costs. You basically pump oxygen into the wastewater during the treatment process, and it's a very high energy intensive process that's expensive. So measuring the BOD is important. And then the TSS is the total suspended solids, which is a measure of basically how much solids you have and how much biomass you'll end up with at the end of the process and how much sludge you're going to have to haul off and dispose of. And so that, again, that's an expensive process of disposing of the solids and removing them. So we have these assumptions. These are all based on State Water Resources Control Board guidelines, assumptions that were produced by the state for different types of commercial activities. Here we can see a comparison of the number of accounts between the district and the city. So the district has 2,775. This includes the overlap area, and the city has 3,582. In terms of the amount of, so that's, you can see the percent number of accounts, 43%, 56%. In terms of the amount of indoor water usage, the district uses a bit more, 51%, 51.8 versus 48%. And when we did the math for all the ESSSUs, we came up with 50.16% for the district and 49.8%. And recall that the default allocation right now is 47% district, 53%. So what we found was a slightly higher allocation for the district based on that math. Go ahead.
We were just curious, considering the percentages of accounts and the water usage being so close and the accounts being 800 different. Can you give us a reason that you might propose as to why the water usage would be so close? I'm not as familiar with your service area as you might be, but I'm assuming these are larger properties and larger, or from an industry standpoint, maybe the industry and the land use is different. Bob, it looks like you have a thought.
Yeah, if I recall, I think we did see that the residential water use within the district was a bit higher than within the city, and I think that some of the larger users are also in the district service area, if I recall right.
Right, I think she's asking why that would be.
It just, that's the way, the land use and the development has occurred.
I mean, at the end of the day, we have to rely on the data that's provided to us. And again, I pointed out that came from 4 different sources. And so any time that we're going through and the data looks wrong or inconsistent from one year to the next, we have to dive in there to make sure that the data is clean, because that's obviously on us to make sure we catch anything obvious. And we looked and we validated, and this is how the data comes out. And we knew this would be a sensitive point, so we definitely looked very closely to make sure that is in fact what the data is reading, and that's how it.
The city has higher density within the city limits
right,
with
so
the
smaller.
city accounts, so a lot more apartment complexes, smaller lots, and so forth.
Right.
The second thing too is that the data for the city for water would have came from one source. It would have came from the cities,
Right.
from the city system. So that higher number, or the number, is validated with the single source.
Right, good point.
I was thinking, let's say there's 10 apartment complexes that each have 20 apartments within the city. When this was done, was each one of those counted as one? Apartment complex was one account. When now it would be 10. So when I'm looking at number of accounts on this data, are you taking into how they've done the billing in the past? So it would have been one account, and maybe, there are an extra 400 accounts there because they only counted as 40 before. You see what I'm saying?
So are you talking about the allocation of the billing
So I'm
costs?
looking at, number of accounts. So if we look at the district, the city has, it would put them even higher. It would put them even higher. You see what I'm saying? So did you use the number of dwellings Or did you use the number of accounts that they gave you?
For this particular metric,
Right,
accounts, not dwellings.
accounts. So the number of dwellings that they will build on in the future will be even higher than this because of the mobile home parks and the apartments. So their account number is actually going to go up once they change their billing practice, right?
No, an apartment complex would still be billed as one account. It might have 10 apartment units, and it count as 10 ESSSUs, but
Right.
it's still one account for billing purposes.
Oh, I see, I see. Okay, so we just changed the billing structure, but not the billing.
Correct.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, it's still one bill, because there's no sub-meters, right? There's a single
Right.
meter,
I was wondering if they were gonna
right?
put in some meters.
Yeah, no, it's just a single bill.
Okay.
Any other questions on this one? So that is the final slide on the cost allocation, essentially getting to this number and pointing out that this is the new number that was calculated for fiscal '21, which is the current fiscal year and next year. As I pointed out, as the city and the district grow at different rates, however that turns out, you can expect to see a slight shift in these numbers over time. And there is a process by which the city and the district will have to reconcile those numbers as they update the billing data and look at how that might shift over time. It should be relatively small, but it will shift over time. So financial plans. So I'll walk you through the various components of the city and the district's financials here. Where I can, I'll put them both on the same slide. Sometimes I have to use a single slide for either the city or the district. In terms of beginning fund balances, so we're talking about cash and investments, the district began this current fiscal year, so July 1st of 2019, they had $10.3 million in cash. The city had $4.6 million in cash and another $1.8 in restricted cash. The $10 million here does account for the $4 million settlement that occurred between the city and the district, whereas the $4 million here does not account for the fact that it was payable. So, in other words, this is accounting for the fact that they were about to receive $4 million, and this does not account for the fact that they were about to have to pay $4 million. So it's kind of not, but what's important, when we do these, we are reflecting the finances of the individual utilities, and at the end of the day, it does get accounted for. It's just not reflected in this particular number. The revenues. The district currently generates about $5.1 million in sewer service charge revenue, and then there's other miscellaneous revenue, such as interest earnings, property tax. Connection fees, that's a very volatile source of revenue. Connection fees are from developers when a new house goes in or a new, any kind of new account is built or a meter is increased in size. So this is based on growth. This happens to be how much was collected and was budgeted for fiscal '20, but this number can certainly go up or down in any given year. And you can see that here the city only collected $51,000 in connection fees. The city collected $5 million or budgeted $5 million for fiscal '20, which is the current fiscal year. And you can see that in the pie chart down here. On the operating side, operating budget side, so this is showing all the operating costs as well as the debt service. What this does not show is the capital spending. So you don't necessarily want to compare these numbers compared to the revenue numbers as whether or not there's a deficit or not, because this does not account for capital spending. That being said, you can see the breakdown of different categories for the district and the city in terms of you can see it in the pie chart and then the numbers up above. The pie chart here does show the capital spending here. While it's not included up in this chart, up in these numbers, I did include the capital spending here to show how much it is relative to the rest of the costs. One thing to point out here is that while the city budgeted $2.3 million in debt service for this year, what actually ended up being paid was $623,000 less than this amount, so about $1.7 million. And that's because of the refinancing that was recently completed. Part of the refinancing agreement involved not paying the last portion of the debt, the last payment during this current fiscal year, and then refinancing some other cost obligations that would be paid off in future years. So just wanted to be clear on that point.
I had a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could explain why the administrative and overhead costs are higher with the district than with the city.
So there are, that would come back to this percentage right here. The difference is probably the 50.16% as compared to the 49.8%. I can't do the math directly in my head right now to see if that exactly matches up, but that's about the scale that we're talking about. It's slightly higher for the district than it is for the city. It's predominantly split up, but there were some. We went through every single individual line item for both the city and the district and identified whether that cost should be shared based on ESSSUs or whether it was a cost that should be specifically allocated to the city or the district. Predominantly, I'd say 97% of the line items were shared with ESSSUs, but there were a few individual line items, some legal fees and some other specific line items that were specifically allocated to the district or the city. And both the city and the district had an opportunity to go through that list with me and Bob, and those were carefully vetted by both sides. Oops. Speaking of the debt service, so I mentioned the 2006 water and wastewater revenue bonds. The previous debt service allocation was 52% district, 48% city for the operating agreement, which was resulting in these numbers: 2.5 million for the district and 2.3% for the city during the current fiscal year. The refinancing of the debt service resulted in a shift in that allocation. Well, first there was the rate study resulted in a different allocation of 54-46. So the reason this percentage is different from the 50.13, different from the 50.16, gets back to this earlier explanation down here that only 74% of that debt service is split by that new ESSSU number, while 25.8% remains fixed at this 35-65. So you end up with a different overall split between the city and the district, which gives us this new percentage here, this 54% district, 46% city. And so we came up with, after the refinancing, these are the new annual debt service. So you can see the significant amount of annual savings that is being recognized by that refinance. So I want to commend everybody involved in making sure that that refinancing happened. It was a lot of work and a lot of folks working together during challenging times to make sure that ratepayers were benefiting from the refinancing of that bond. So I think that's something that we can all be proud of. You'll notice that this split here is not 54-46 necessarily if you do the math. And the reason for that is because the city and the district had individual negotiations with what was included in that debt. And the city, as I mentioned, first they deferred a little bit of debt service that was supposed to be paid this year. So they pushed a little bit of debt service down the road. And then they also included part of the settlement agreement. They folded some of that settlement agreement cost into the, actually it's right here. The city paid $1 million of it with cash reserves. They paid $1.4 million with proceeds from the refinance bond, so that raised their debt service. and the remaining 1.6% was an internal loan that will be repaid internally. So that's why if you do the math, this doesn't come out as 54 or 46.
One other point with that, the district also used 2.5 million of its reserves to buy down debt during the refinancing as well, correct?
Yes, good point. Yeah, the district also, used their cash reserves, which I pointed out was $10.3 million, so they had the extra cash reserves. Thank you for the reminder. And they paid down part of their debt, so that brought that debt service even closer to one another.
And just one other point with this that I want to point out to both boards is that while we have the 54-46 ratio established by the rate study and what was the debt that was refinanced, the refinancing agreement between the city and the district still calls us to meet to develop and come to an agreement on the true-up process for reconciling that each year, which it will change each year based upon the portion of the debt that is attributed to water usage.
Right. Yeah, the ESSSU, as those change, the debt service will change as well. One other element here that's pretty important for debt is the debt service coverage ratio. So the debt service coverage ratio is a financial metric that basically measures how easily a utility can afford to pay for its debt. If you have a debt service coverage ratio of 1.0, it means that you can exactly pay for your debt with your last dollar. That's 1.0. So they want you to have a cushion of 1.2, showing that you can easily pay for your debt, that you're not paying it with your last dollar. So your bond covenants, the rules that you signed when you got this debt, require you to maintain a 1.2 at a minimum, or else you're in default of the terms of the loan. As rate consultants, we generally advise our clients to try to get your debt coverage up to 1.5, because the higher your debt coverage is, up to a certain point, the credit agencies look on that very favorably, and you become eligible your credit gets better, and it makes you eligible for cheaper debt in the future if you do want to go out for more debt, and that saves your ratepayers money when you have a higher credit rating. So these numbers are important because as we show you the financial forecast, we'll show you that we maintained your coverage at least at 1.2, and that we're working to get it up closer to 1.5 over the long term. Here's the capital spending over the next 10 years that was forecasted. You can see, by and large, the capital spending is very similar between the city and the district. Most of those projects are projects that benefit both the city and the district equally, and so they were split based on ESSSUs. There are a couple of projects that were specific to the city that were allocated directly to the city, namely the downtown streetscape in Dora City, and so those costs were 100% city.
One more clarifying point in here. So the city, I believe, has about $2.1 million built into its improvements within the collection system. And currently the district does not have built into its collection system capital improvement amounts, correct? For its sole collection system.
Within these costs?
Yes.
If that's what these two if you're
right.
Yeah, okay. So if those are collections, then yes, those are additional improvements that the district are not. It's not additional investments.
Well, doesn't that graph show that I believe that there's a $700,000 a year allocation in this rate study for capital improvements in the district? It wasn't that your assumption?
Yes, more or less. It's in these years, over time it gets larger because of inflation. But in the short term, it's about $700,000 of capital spending that's assumed will be used for rehabilitation projects.
Okay.
It's part of a shared operation, though. It's not specific to the district.
Yeah.
So the city has specific projects built into this analysis, but the district's all its capital is shared.
Well, can you explain the anomalies at 2021 and 23? why it drops so?
The specific projects? I'm not familiar with the specific projects. Could you help out, Dan?
It's simply that when doing the analysis, we didn't anticipate projects of the same magnitude in those 2 years as the other years. So the information came from the city's 5-year CIP program, and it just so happened those 2 particular years were just less intensive.
So the 700,000 that you said was an estimate, not based on actual projects, but just an estimate of what would be spent. That's 700,000 for each agency, not shared.
Correct. It's
Okay.
about 1.4, 1
Yes.
million that's going to be executed and going to be split based on ESSSUs.
To clarify, Candace, those shared ones are generally improvements that are happening at the wastewater plant. So we're paying our portion, you're paying your portion. I think the distinction Sage was trying to make earlier is beyond that, we have collection systems which need to be maintained as well. Currently, the city has a couple of large collection system improvements, so that's why we have big spikes. The district does not.
Oh, so it's assumed most of that will go towards the wastewater.
That's
treatment plant?
what the shared expenses generally are.
Okay.
So on that line, the $700,000 each, 1.4, that's not part of everything listed on page 22 where it's got like the 20 shared items. These are in addition to?
I believe those projects are all
When it lists all the projects and the trucks and the pavers, and so the 700 is on top of this? This is the 700?
That is, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question here. I'll just try to jive a couple things. The connection fees were a big number for the district, but it looks like the capital spending to accommodate them is no different than what the city's going to spend. It's a little
I'm sorry,
surprising.
I didn't catch the question.
Looks like the capital spending is equivalent for the city and the district, but the city has a huge number of new hookups that they're planning for, connection fees. Yeah, in the district, is that, say that wrong?
I think that the connection fee revenue for the district in the most recent year or in this year was pretty high because of some large projects coming through, but that's probably an anomalous amount of revenue. It's probably not always $1 million a year.
Well, and they're connecting to an existing pipe, an existing line, so it's not additional work for the district. It's not an expenditure for the district to connect someone.
Yeah. And primarily, connection fees are supposed to be used to pay down debt because it was, a portion of the plant was capacity built to cover that. So technically on that side, but I wanted just the differentiation with that large collection. There was a single large project in the district. I think it was the Brush Street Commons. Am I referring? I don't know if I got the name correct, but the new apartment complex on Brush Street was what drove, I think, about 900,000 or so of those fees for that single project. So that's why the district had a large collection that fiscal year.
One last element in the financial plan are the reserve targets. So this is the level of reserves that we aim to maintain over the course of a long-term financial plan. Having these types of policies are good for your credit rating. Again, when you're looked at by credit agencies, they want to see your coverage ratio, they want to see various things, and they want to see that you abide by strong reserve policies. The two reserve policies that are being recommended by this study is that you maintain an operating reserve of at least 6 months of operating budget. So you look at what your annual operating budget is and you keep about 6 months of that in cash in the event of unexpected changes to costs or cash flow. And so that would equate to about $1.5 million held aside by the district and $1.3 million for the city. The other reserve would be your emergency and capital improvement reserve, which helps you anticipate the potential for capital spending, whether it's emergency capital spending or just a spike in planned capital spending. And that's equal to about the average 1 year of capital spending over a period of time. So it's about $650,000, close to the $700,000 that we mentioned earlier for both the city and the district. So here's a picture, a financial picture for just the district. We'll look at the city next. So this is the rate increases, the rate revenue increases that are being proposed are down at the bottom here. So proposing no rate increase for January 1st, 2001, and then 1%, 1%, 1%, 1% for the next 4 years after that. What you're looking at up here is in the background is the revenue. So the green background represents the revenue. The dark green down here is your non-rate revenue, so revenue that you receive from sources other than your rates. You can see it's a bit higher here because of that connection fee revenue that you collected in the current year. That's not considered a normal year, so you can see the baseline of green down here. The light green represents your current rate revenue with your current rates, and then the dark green at the top represents the additional rate revenue that you'll collect as a result of these rate increases, the 1% rate increases. So you can see the increase in the rates here. The foreground represents expenses. So the dark blue at the bottom are your operating expenses. The hashed blue represents your debt service. You can see the drop in debt service from 1 year to the next. That's the result of the refinancing. And then the light blue represents your capital spending, the cash capital spending. So any year where the revenue is higher than the expenses represents a surplus year, and when the expenses are higher than the revenues, it's vice versa. You can see that in every year that's being forecasted here, the revenues are higher than the expenses, and so you can see your reserves, which are shown down here, will slowly climb over the course of the next 10 years. So you're starting with about $8 million after paying down. The reason it's $8 million here and not the 10.3 is because that $2.5 million was to pay down part of your bonds. So you're starting from about just below $8 million, and it slowly climbs over time. And you can see the dashed line are your reserve targets. So you can see you're well above your reserve targets, and it's still climbing. The reason that it's still that where you're proposing rate increases despite this dynamic is because of your debt coverage ratio. So this is the level of rate revenue that you need in order to maintain a debt coverage ratio that's going to be looked favorably upon by the rating agencies. And these are the numbers that were submitted to your bond issuers when you refinance. And so they're relying on these types of metrics in order to give you the deal that you got for that refinancing, reducing your debt service by $500,000. So while it does require you to raise rates a little bit, very slightly over the long term, it's saving your ratepayers a lot of money by giving you this strong financial profile and allowing you to qualify for the debt that you just refinanced.
If I could add to that, the way the debt service coverage ratio is calculated, it's looking at operating expenses and your debt obligation and then a little cushion on top of that. The calculation is not looking at any money that's being used for capital expenditures. And so the way the calculation works, it shows that you're increasing the amount of your reserve balances over time in maintaining that ratio. But what this is also telling you is that you have additional capacity for more capital spending. Mm-hmm. So if the district were to decide that it needed to replace some of the collection system, there is money here. You know, the difference between the dashed line and the solid red line is money that's available effectively for capital projects so that you could do some rehabilitation work to your collection system.
So I guess something I struggle with is, well, you know, it's the obvious question that we're saving hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars by refinancing, yet when you look at a customer's bill, it will go up, even though there's a 0% increase the first year, just based on how we're going to do the billing. It's going to go up on our average customer $4 or $5, and then it's just going to continue to go up 1%, small but still increase. So our customer is not seeing the benefit of any refinancing at this point based on this. Because the only benefit they see right now is financial, right? I mean, maybe they can see a benefit if we have money to do some big capital improvement, but I doubt that would lead to a decrease in their monthly bill. So you're showing a big gap of money available to do capital projects, but is there any room based on what the bank needs to bring that red line down in order to benefit the ratepayer?
So I hear what you're saying, and different customers will be affected differently because there are going to be some structural changes to the rates that we're proposing, and there are certain customers that will see an increase. There'll be others that will see a slight decrease. We are making recommendations based on industry standards for how to set rates in a way that's legally defensible. I guess my counterpoint would be that I haven't done a rate study for any clients in the last 5 years that has these kinds of rate increases. Usually it's north of 5%, sometimes it's double-digit % rate increases. So while your customers may feel like they're paying more and more, if you look across the state and you look at the other utilities, when you look at inflation, which is about 3%, and you look at all the decaying infrastructure, which is really coming through a full cycle right now. Most of the utilities in California and the United States is at about 50, 60 years. It's starting to fall apart. All the utilities are coming to a point where they have to start replacing these things, and rate increases are going up tremendously. So while it may not feel like they're getting the benefits of the refinancing, I think that they're doing very well with such modest rate increases.
They are receiving the benefit of that refinancing in these rates, because before we considered the effect of refinancing, when we were looking at preliminary drafts, we were talking double-digit increases year after year in percentages. So this has alleviated that for the ratepayer. They don't have to absorb those significant rate increases now because of the refinancing. So here we are trending below inflation for the next 10 years. Granted, we're really concerned with the first 5, but for 10 years, these are a direct result of the refinancing.
And we're still
Thank you.
faced with the possibility of a large planned expansion in the future. You know, some significant costs. So I think we need to keep our reserves up where, like Mark's saying, we'll have a good debt coverage ratio. We'll get more favorable financing for the next go-around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I want to only add to what Mr. Buffalo said, that these are modest rate increases, and they are because of the refinancing. But if you consider that these rates haven't been raised also in quite a while, this rate study is really overdue. To have them be this modest after that period of time is impressive.
It's frankly unheard of when rates haven't been adjusted in this long to still only have 1% rate increases. I've never seen it. So I think the refinancing is helping a lot. And those were slides I was very happy to get rid of before the refinancing was finalized, because Bob and I didn't feel comfortable coming and saying, here's your rate increases if that refinance wasn't done. If it hadn't gotten signed and stamped, we'd be up here saying, well, this will be a great scenario, but first you need to get refinanced, and this is what your rates are going to look like. And I'm happy to be able to stand up here today and say you've completed the refinancing, and this is all you need to do. So we don't need to look at that doom and gloom scenario. On the city side, we have a similar but slightly different financial scenario. You started with fewer reserves, and there's just a different financial profile in general. But same idea, the background is the revenue, and the foreground is the expenses. We're looking at a 5% rate increase on July 1st, 2001, followed by 2%, 2%, 1%, 1%. And again, this is really being driven by the debt coverage. So these coverage numbers were what were advised to the city by the city's bond council, and were the numbers that got the deal done for their portion of the refinance. And you can see the reserves may stay very steady over time. Again, as Bob pointed out, this extra reserve, these extra reserves here doesn't mean it has to stay that way. To me, this looks like an opportunity to use the cash on hand to be able to address deficiencies in the system and any capital projects that have been deferred. This would be a good opportunity to use this extra cash to address those. And it looks like over the long term there'll be about $4 million in reserves, so that looks like maybe $400,000 a year that could be spent sustainably in addressing some of those capital projects. And even more so for the district with $8 million in reserves, or an extra $6 million or $8 million, you could address even more capital projects that way. So that's the end of the financial plan portion and the rate revenue increases. I do want to point out that these rate increases, as was previously pointed out, that these are the increases by the ratepayers as a whole, the average rate increase that's going to be experienced by the ratepayers as a whole. Because we're about to talk through some structural changes to the rates, in year one, the rate increases will be a little different for everybody depending on whether you're commercial or residential and how much water you use and how those structural changes affect you. And so we will look at some examples to show how it affects different customers in different ways. But it's very important in terms of messaging and talking to your constituents that they won't necessarily see a 5% rate increase in year one. It may be a little bit more, it may be a little bit less. And same for the district. It may not be 0%. It may go up, it may go down.
Also, since all of the rate structure changes and the updates with the cost of service analysis are in the first year, in the second, third, fourth, fifth years of this, the bill changes would be uniform across all customers within either the city or district, so either the 2% or the 1%, because all of the rate structure and other refinements to the rates all occur in the first year.
That's right. Thank you. So, talking about cost of service and rate design, again, this is where we do the analysis to determine how costs should be allocated to different types of customers and how those revenues should be collected. So just as a refresher, your current rates right now, the district charges a usage rate of $6.06 per HCF, and HCF is 100 cubic feet, which is about 748 gallons. There is a monthly service charge of $53 per dwelling unit, and this is a minimum charge, this $53. So the $6.60 is, as it points out here, this monthly service charge includes 3.4 HCF. I'm sorry, so within this $53, you get 3.4 HCF of usage, and beyond 3.4, you start paying the $6.06. So there's a certain amount of usage that I don't want to say you get it for free, but it's built into your base charge, and then after that 3.4, you start paying the $6.60. Commercial they only pay the usage charge, so they only pay the $9.69. They don't have this base charge, but they do have a minimum charge. So in other words, if your usage isn't, if you only use one HCF, so it would be $9.69, you would still pay the $53.47 as a minimum charge. But any usage above the $53 you'd pay for at this rate. You can see that the rate for Class 1 is significantly lower than the rate for Class 4 at $23. For the city side, they don't have that same dynamic of having an allowance, and as a result, the charge per HCF is significantly lower. So this is essentially just it's a different rate structure where the city charges $62 per HCF and $2.45 for any water usage, no allowance built into it. This structure is less typical in the industry. When you look out there, this idea of an allowance of a certain amount of usage is just, I'm not going to say one's more right or one's more wrong, but this just isn't seen as often, whereas this is a more typical structure where you collect all your fixed costs through the $62, and then you collect more of your variable costs through the usage rate. And on the commercial side, it's identical in terms of the structure, that there's a minimum charge of $62, but all the costs are collected through this usage rate depending on the classification. Miscellaneous notes, there are some accounts out there that have negotiated special rates. We didn't account for those. We just assumed that all accounts were going to be treated based on their classification. Those are part of the current practice, but not part of what's being recommended in the current in the rate study. We did mention that the city bills mobile homes as commercial, and going forward, we are treating them as residential. And we are making the recommendation that the city should continue to review its billing records to make sure that the different commercial accounts are correctly classified. So when a new commercial account joins the system, they either get put in class 1, 2, 3, or 4. During our study, we did our best to look at the name on the account to try to make sense of whether it was correctly classified. Some of them are simply named John Doe or whatever it may be, so we had no way of knowing what kind of commercial account it was, and so we couldn't validate what that was. And we're just recommending as the city move forward that they continue to make sure that all of its commercial accounts are correctly classified as 1, 2, 3, or 4. The rate design changes that we're recommending as part of this study are listed up here. So the first is that we are recommending that the cost allocation methodology and the rate structures be identical for the city and the district. This simplifies things quite a bit for the study. It simplifies things for your customers. It allows us to make recommendations that are most in line with the industry standards that we would recommend as rate consultants either way. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense for us to come up here and recommend one rate structure for one agency and another for the other agency. So Bob and I looked at the structures and made recommendations based on our experience and what we thought was appropriate for the city and the district. And since they have very similar service areas and very, very similar costs, it was pretty easy to come up with recommendations that were the same for both. Again, the rates will end up being different because the rate revenue requirements are different. As I pointed out, the rate increases are different, and so the amount of revenue, total revenue that's needed by the city versus the district is different. So the amount in each of the rates will be different, although the structures will be identical. We are recommending that you retain your current customer classes, which is a single residential class based on dwelling units, and then the 4 commercial classes based on strength. We are recommending that you have the fixed service charge to all customers. So all customers will pay a fixed service charge. Residential pay that service charge based on the number of dwelling units that they have, and commercial will pay the service charge based on the previous winter water usage. So the service charge will be higher for a commercial account that has higher water usage. We are recommending that you discontinue this concept of a water allowance, that you get a certain amount of water built into your service charge. We are recommending that you measure your winter water usage based on the average water usage from January, February, and March. Right now, that's currently how the district does it, is they look at those 3 months. The city currently just looks at January. The industry standard is to look at 3 months rather than 1. The reason that's typically better is because if certain businesses happen to be closed in January or whatever it may be, they go skiing that month, then you don't want to have that noise in your data, so it's safer to spread it over 3 months.
That actually kind of hits one of the questions I had.
Okay.
So when you looked at the average water usage, when you got all the water districts in the city, I know we had 3-month averages. When you looked at the cities, did you only get the 1 month, or did you do a 3-month for them as well?
We looked at 3 months for everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we recalculated strength multipliers for the commercial customers. So we kept the assumptions the same on the strengths, but we recalculated it as a part of the cost of service analysis. So here there's a bunch of tables, and if you've looked at the report, you might recognize this is what we called step 1 in the study. I'm not going to go with, there were 5 steps for the cost allocation process. It's detailed very well in the report, and so if you're interested in the technical aspects, I encourage you to take a look at the report, and if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me or Bob with additional questions. But essentially what the study does is that it looks at all of the ESSSUs that we already talked about. We also looked at what's called ESSFUs, which is instead of strength, it's flow. So this is measuring accounts just purely on their hydraulic flow, regardless of the strength of the sewage. And that's important to measure because a certain part of your system, namely your collection system, doesn't care about strength. It's just moving water. And so the way that we measure that cost for the system is based on flow. And so we ignore strength in that, for that particular part of the calculation. And so we get a bunch of numbers here for the district and the city based on the type of accounts that they have, water usage, estimated wastewater flow in millions of gallons, the strength assumptions that we already talked about measured in milligrams per liter for both BOD and suspended solids. And we can do the math to figure out, okay, single-family residential for the district is loading 202,000 pounds of BOD every year. We were able to do that math based on the billing data and on the water usage data and the strength assumptions. And so with these numbers, we're able to look at the cost of the district and allocate cost responsibility to each of these individual customer classes. And we end up with these results here, which show us how much we want to collect from single family for this fixed monthly charge and the usage rate. So these are the results here for the rates that are being proposed for year 1. So this is with the 0% rate increases for the district and the 5% rate increases for the city. The fixed monthly charge would be $45.86 for district customers and $49.32 for the city. And then you see the usage charges here are quite similar, $3.61 and $3.58. One thing that you'll notice, one of the big differences that you'll notice between the current rates and the proposed rates is a much closer relationship between the low-strength commercial and the high-strength commercial. And so this is basically acknowledging that the current rates we find is overcharging your high-strength commercial customers based on our analysis. And we can't necessarily judge the existing rates because we don't have the records that demonstrate where those numbers came from. We can just tell you what our recommendation is based on. And so for the customers that will see a slight increase, it's because these high-strength customers are going to be seeing a decrease in their bills to correct the or to just reflect the cost of service that we are calculating. And so here's a comparison. Thank you. Here's a comparison of the rates. So again, here are the current rates. Again, you can see this difference between the low rates that used to be $6 and $23 versus $3 versus $10. And so we gave you some bill impacts, so some comparisons of what this bill will, or what the rates will do for different types of customers. So for a single family, a district single family home with low water usage, their current bill would be $50. The proposed $50.83, the proposed bill would be $56.70, and the increase is 11% for that particular type of customer. A single family with high water usage would see a decrease of 20%. So yes, there are some customers that are being are going to pay more, and there's other customers that are going to pay less. It's important to understand that going into this study, one of our objectives, or the principal objective that we have to follow is legal defensibility. Proposition 218 is, again, the law that rules this how you set rates in California, and it's a very, very poignant issue right now with folks going around looking for reasons to sue based on cost of service, that you can't demonstrate that your study is based on the cost to provide service. Bob and I did our best to be as fair as we could in allocating costs, following industry standard. And frankly, to do that, you have to be blind to which customers are going to potentially be negatively impacted, because again, we can't speak for the rates that are currently being charged. We don't know where they came from. We don't know the basis for those rates. And so this number isn't just a reflection of our results, it's a reflection of the change from your current rates to the proposed rates. And there's unfortunately nothing that we can do about that. We did our best to mitigate rate increases to customers. We looked for a path that would have the lowest impact to customers as a whole. Unfortunately, there are some customers that will pay more than others. You can see a similar pattern, well, actually a slightly different pattern here. On the city side, the smaller water users will actually pay less, and the larger water users will pay more. So this dynamic, the fact that it flips from here to here, is a direct reflection of what we talked about earlier here with these rate structures. The way that this is designed, how you get a certain amount of water built into your rate, but then once you start paying more, it's very expensive. And in this case, where you pay the whole time, but the usage rate is cheap the whole time. So that's going to have some dynamics on different types of customers, depending on if you're a large water user or a low water user. In the city's case, if you're a large water user, you're doing pretty well because your usage rate's really small here, right? And if that usage rate goes up, then you're going to end up paying more, which is exactly what we're seeing. The large water users are going to pay more, and the inverse is true for district customers. So that's why we're seeing a difference in the bill impacts between different types of customers. And then I mentioned earlier that the high water or the high strength commercial are paying a really high rate right now, over $20 per unit, which is pretty high. And our study found a lower number.
I wanted to add, related to the bill impacts here, the percentage changes or the dollar amount changes are dramatic, as Mark has indicated, in which are going up and which are going down and so on. But if you look at the proposed bill amounts between the city and the district for similarly situated customers, low, medium, and high use for the residential or the different commercial classes, those bill amounts are very comparable. I mean, they're a few dollars apart in each case, but they're very similar. And that's because the cost structure is basically the same between the city and the district. And there are little differences, as Mark has been pointing out, but the bill amounts overall are comparable between the city and the district. So, and again, it's what we're seeing in terms of the impact is not so much of the way that we're calculating the bills, but it's more a reflection of the way the bills have been calculated previously and the differences that occurred there. And it was very important for everybody in the study at the staff level and for us that we develop a comparable, a consistent approach and methodology for both the city and the district. I mean, that was day one marching order was that we were to do that. So I think these are all important considerations to where we are at.
And to Bob's point, conversely, if you look at the current rate, I mean, look how different this exact same customer pays for their bill, $110 versus $83. It doesn't make sense. I mean, that's exactly the same customer who live across the street from one another. One happens to be in the city, one happens to be in the district, and they pay $30 difference on their bill. It doesn't make sense. So while we are seeing large bill impacts, we're bringing everyone to the middle is the way to look at it.
Sir? Do we have numbers of customers in each of these categories?
Yes. In the first column here on slide 22, you have, I'm sorry, that's ESSUs, hold on. Here, sorry, in slide 21, in the first column, that's the number of accounts. Yeah, that's all that.
Does that tell me how many are low, average, and high?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant the types of customers. In terms of, no, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. All I can tell you is that the average, it's going to be sort of a bell curve, with the vast majority being around 6 and outliers being 3 and 12.
Well, it's 5.6 was what the calculation was for an average residence in the study.
5.6?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which
5.68, yeah.
ended up being 141 gallons
Right.
per unit per day.
That sounds about right.
On page 8 of the rate study, it does show a summary of accounts, dwelling units, by low, moderate, medium, and high strength for commercial, which is, I think, what you're looking for.
No, we have that number. The gentleman was looking for the number of accounts that are residential, high, medium, low usage.
Oh,
The example that we gave here on the bill impact, these 3 types of accounts, he was looking for the distribution of how many customers are classified as low or medium. We just picked these numbers as, you might fall, you might identify with one of these types of customers more than another, depending on where you fall.
so that's something we would have to establish in our billing, that new process of residential levels.
No, this is just an example. This is just.
It's just an example.
Yeah,
Oh,
this is just say,
okay.
if you're an average water user, this is probably what your bill's
No,
gonna
I
look like.
understand. No,
And
I'm
if you're
sorry.
low or if you're high, because people want to be able to say,
Yeah.
well, how's this gonna affect me?
Yeah.
And so, all the commercial examples we gave, these are all average for commercial. So we looked at, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. This should say commercial 2, 3, and 4 here. They all say 1. So this, apologies. This is, there's a typo here. So this should say commercial 1, 2, 3, and 4 going down. And so we just looked at the average water usage for the different types of commercial accounts. And again, for single family, we took three different points depending on where people might be able to relate to.
But according to your study, a single-family resident can go up to 5.68 before they're charged more. Is that correct?
No.
Oh,
No,
That's what their estimate for the average
Okay.
customer.
I
If you
t-
take all the customers, all the water usage, it ended up being 5.68.
so it would
100
be
cubic
between
feet
those
per
two.
customer on the average of over the whole.
The average person would
Okay.
fall into that 70.
Okay.
So the only reason that number is relevant at all in the study, the 5.38, is because we had to calculate ESSSUs for commercial. And as I said, we looked at commercial water usage and said if you use a certain amount of water, this is how you compare it to a single family home. And so if they use the 5.6 HCF, then we'd say, okay, you used the same amount, you're a 1 because you're equal to a single family home. If they use twice as much, then they'd be assigned a 2, et cetera. So that's the only significance of that, of knowing that number, is to be able to calculate the ESSSUs for commercial.
So if somebody in our district asked, we would have to refer them to their water company to see how much water they're actually using on a monthly basis.
Yeah, but it's also, if it's a commercial account, if it's a residential customer, you just ask them how many dwelling units they have and how much, and then their water usage.
Right.
They can look at their sewer bill to see what they were charged previously, and it will tell them how they behaved last winter, and that should give them a pretty good sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well,
This is Lindsay. I have a quick question, Mark.
yes.
I guess maybe to the group. I think it was mentioned before that the capital spending really just incorporates CIP for a wastewater treatment plant. So I guess I want to confirm that if there is district plans, improvements or rehabilitation on district collection system that should be integrated into this rate study, right?
Yes, it would be good to account for any plans to spend money on the collection system, yes.
It's with this show that there's been too much to discuss. The one that the district invested.
Right, if there's like a capital planned improvement that costs $1 million or more, I mean, it would affect your recommendation.
Right, Wing C, this is Teresa with the district. We don't have any capital improvement plans over the next 5 years. The only ones are included are the shared with the city. So if you look on that page, you'll see that there's no district only. They're all shared with the city. Oh, if we should include some, I think the only one we really had, yeah, we don't have any. The only major one we had was a lift station, which it was allocated in last year's budget. So,
I'm gonna try to talk the district and the city into some extra charges in the capital improvement plan here, but I don't know when a good time to start my dance on the soapboxes.
One thing I'd like to add to address that issue, if you go back to the pro forma graphs, that for the district, you know, the height of that red line above the dash line, it's about, looks like about $6 to $8 million higher. And so you actually, over this planning period, have the ability to spend $6 to $8 million on some of these collection system improvements without it affecting the rates. So if you wanted to do $600,000 a year for the next 10 years, you could do that without affecting the rates. The fact that you don't have that capital program defined now, you know, means that we can't include it in the plan. But if you were to adopt that next year, you could do that without affecting the rate. Similarly, on the water or on the city side, you know, there's a capacity there of about $4 million to do collection system projects over this planning period.
About 400 to 600,000 a year that could be spent, and depending, like the
Yes.
city, when they have the spikes, if we wanted to do a particularly large project in 1 year, then
Yeah.
it would just
Exactly.
decrease. Okay.
So there is capacity up to those
Right.
amounts to undertake
So we
this.
have time to figure out our capital improvement program based on that, I would
Yes.
say.
So that, to answer Wing C's question, after that additional discussion, while it's great to include any future capital spending, if there is some capital spending that's missing from the plan currently, there is room in here to accommodate that in the future. So even if it's not formally in the study, it doesn't preclude the district from being able to do it, or the city. So I wouldn't say that it needs to be in the study. It'd be great to put all the information that we have in there, but it doesn't remove any flexibility for being able to spend that money in the future.
I want to emphasize the importance of and the need of being able to maintain the collection systems that we're required under the state to maintain the collection systems in a certain to a certain level. And if we let them degrade, we run the risk of being in violation with the state, and also run the risk of civil lawsuits as well against us. And we don't want to be in that situation. So as we move forward with the budgeting, I think that it's imperative that the district and the city really look towards those capital improvement plans to ensure that we're not putting our ratepayers at risk for either of those 2 points.
We talked about that today. We definitely feel it. What's the intrusion rate of the sewer system during the winter into the pipelines?
Well, it's different in every location, but,
Overall for the wastewater treatment
yeah, so the
plant?
wastewater treatment plant goes from about 1.5 in the summer to as high as 8, you know, on a huge rainstorm, but 5 or 6 during the wet times.
Okay, thank you.
It really depends on the magnitude of the storm, how saturated the soil is, and what's happening. I think our typical summer flow now is really more around 2.5 million gallons a day. And you'll see one-day spikes all the way into the 20 million gallon days, but sort of sustained winter flow is usually somewhere in the 7 to 8. I'll tell you though, going back to what Sage was referring to, as part of Measure Y, we replaced big pieces of collection system in both the district and the city, and we have already seen measurable results from those large-scale replacements that happen on Luce, Washington Observatory. Our base flow this year in the spring, even though we had a very wet spring last year, was down almost 1 million gallons a day. And so far this year, even when it was raining in November, we didn't see anything close to what we saw. So not only does that save us from litigation and keep us compliant, the less water we have to treat, the less chemicals we have to buy, and it's great for long-term savings in general.
And this is Lucy again. I just wanted to follow up on, when looking at this, at least the district's projections and looking at the reserve buildup, there is an obligation with the refinancing to have a rate stabilization fund funded at $2 million. It is the district's money, but it's not meant to be, withdrawn every year. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Wingsy. So that would move the dash line on slide 16 up by $2 million. If there's an additional rate stabilization reserve that's being required, that would, of $2 million, then that would move up the line. But that still leaves, $4 to $6 million in cash that could be used for those types of projects. But thank you, Wingsy. I'll circle back to you and make sure that that's in the study. That's reflected in the study.
Right, and the district still has to collect on some of its settlement money too, so, yeah. So the cash that's available currently is not what it appears to be here.
So, to my last slide.
Can we hang on there for a second? I have one more question about the previous data. I'm still curious about the second to last slide, the one you were just on there. I'm looking at the, 11-point-something% increase, and I'm just trying to think who these people are. Do we know if that's typical for small apartments, for mobile homes, or any information about who's going to, get hit with the highest rate increase?
So are you speaking of
the first line there?
First line for a low water user?
Yeah, so the lowest water users are going to see the biggest hike in their bills.
For the district?
Well, in that case, it's the district, and the city,
yeah,
it'll
in
be
the city,
only
they're going to see a
3%.
decrease.
But what do we know about who those people are?
So, lowest water users could be anyone from someone in a huge home with only one person living there, or it could be a small apartment. So it's a variety of people. It's likely people who live alone, who produce small amounts of water.
We can leave it there.
Yeah. Is that right? Did that get left off? Make sure. You have it? Okay, good. So in terms of next steps, the process that has to be followed in order to raise rates, and again, adopting this financial plan was what was conveyed to your bond advisors and to the banks when you refinance the loan. And so there's a certain expectation that these financial plans be followed. Well, there's a high expectation that they be followed to some degree. And in order to raise your rates or to adopt the rates that are being proposed, you have to go through the Prop 280 adoption process, which involves you direct your staff to send out a 218 notice which is a notification that will be sent in the mail to all of your accounts, which will notify them of the proposed rate increases. A 45-day waiting period needs to go by after sending it out, and then you'll hold a public hearing, and during that public hearing, the board and the council will respectively vote on whether or not to raise the rates. Before they can vote, you have to take a tally of any protests that come out. So when you send out this notification, you're inviting property owners to protest against the rates. If 50% of your ratepayers come out and protest voluntarily against the rates, then you are not able, you won't be allowed legally to vote to increase the rates. That's a very high bar for a community this size. It won't happen. So you will receive a certain number of protests, and at the protest hearing, you'll vote on whether or not to adopt these rates. Because of that process of needing to send out the 218 notice, the 45-day waiting period, the clock is ticking if we want to adopt these on July 1st. So Bob and I came to this meeting hoping that an action could be taken to direct staff to send out the 218. It's not a, I'm not sure how it would be classified in terms of giving direction to staff for the board and the city.
So the city staff's recommendation for this item on this item tonight is to receive the presentation and to direct staff to initiate the 218 process to adjust the wastewater rates annually for the 5-year effective period, July 1st, 2020 for the city of Ukiah. And because of the timeline, we are asking the city council to seriously consider that recommendation.
What constitutes a protest? I mean, is this something they write?
It's any written protest where they give their name, their address, and say that they protest against the proposed rate increases. They can also show up to the public hearing in person and write it on a piece of paper and hand it in. But it has to be written on a piece of paper with their name and their address.
I think something that we probably need to add to this is changing our ordinances, because we are changing the methodology for billing, right? And I believe that's within our ordinances. So we do have to put that on the to-do list to change our ordinance before we can change the rates.
That would be a legal question to work with your legal counsel on in terms of the specific wording.
Yeah, he just nodded, that's on the list.
So yes, that is a great question for the city of Ukiah. We've already begun that process with the city attorney's office.
One silly thing, protests need a parcel number, at least it is for the water rates last year, whatever it was. Same process? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will make a motion that we adopt recommendation 1. And also direct staff to initiate the Prop 18 process to adjust wastewater rates annually for a 5-year period effective July 1st, 2020.
There's one question I have before we go forward, and that is an issue with percentages, a splitter percentage, that I'd like to see why there's a difference there. It's on a page that is not numbered. It's 5 pages in from the top of the report, and there's a 4% missing on there on the splitter percentages.
They're all different for the rate, for the debt,
He's looking at the
for
report.
the capacity of the plant. All those are different.
Right. I realize that when you add them, they have to add up to 100%. This one doesn't, and I don't know if there's a reason why. There's a 43.65% for the district and 42.35% for the city. When you add those two, there's 96% rather than 100%.
Let me circle over.
Operating and maintenance expenses.
Yeah, that was supposed to be at 48. That's a typo. It should be 48%.
Okay.
It's not numbered?
I think
but
the
it's
43%
like
is
5
correct.
pages in from the top.
I think that's supposed to be 57. That's right, that's supposed to be 57. I apologize.
One more page down that one.
What
Yeah.
page or what document was that?
This one.
It's not numbered, it's 5 pages in.
The other issue I found is really just a typo. It clearly looks like it's a typo. Although I could be wrong, it's on page 16. Although you got 1/3 into the packet. It says city ratio decreased as the city, as the same pace, but I believe it should be at the same pace. Page 16.
So page 16, there's a grammatical error, or?
Right, it's about 1/3 into the packet. Under customer growth,
So section 3.2.5 on page 16.
last line.
Decreases at, okay, yeah, as, there's a
I found
typo,
it, yeah.
should say
But
decreases
in
at
the
instead of as.
52 is supposed to be
Same
57?
pace.
Mark, I have some typo corrections too. I can just email them to you though.
Okay. Thanks, Lindsay. Lindsay.
I think generally the refunding numbers need to be updated as well.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I didn't necessarily put in the exact refunding numbers in the study as were finalized, and that we can talk about the reasons for that, but ultimately it didn't change the financial projections.
And what we would do is finalize the report as we go forward. So we'll correct the typos and make sure all the numbers all line up and update, the financing, if that needs to be done with the final report. And that final report would be available during the 45-day public notice period.
Speaking of that, so how many days total do you think we should give for this process to meet the July 1st date?
Well, the 218 letter hasn't been drafted yet. Sometimes we already have it drafted at this point, but because of the nature of the project, we haven't yet drafted the letter. So we would need to draft the letter, get it finalized, get it to a printer and print it. I'd say the fastest we could get that done would be 2 weeks. That's probably very optimistic, so I would give it more like 3 weeks to get that process done. And then it would be 45 days after it's sent. So that's 2 months and a week about. And then the public hearing would have to happen at some point in June. You wouldn't want it to be the last day of June. It would
Right.
have to fall on probably on the normal meeting or another. Actually, the public hearing should be at your respective individual meetings. It doesn't need to be a joint meeting for that because you're just adopting the proposed rates. So whenever the district or the city meets, maybe your second meeting of June.
So as long as the district approves the rate study in the next 2 weeks, we should be on the same time for both agencies?
Yeah, we could certainly hit the same. We could, if the district is able to direct staff to send out the letter in the next 2 weeks, I think we could stay on the same schedule.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have city council has a motion. Is there a second?
Yeah, I'll second.
So Brown, Scalmanini?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
point of order, are we going to open public comment on this
Yes.
item?
So, any public comment? Seeing none. Roll call. Go ahead.
Green is on. I have one last comment, or question. We talked about, mentioned mobile homes, mentioned apartments. How does growth in ADUs affect this? Because the laws are changing, and I don't know what they are right now about cost for hookups or, is it automatic rate increase when one is completed? Does that play into this at all?
So the ADUs, for those who aren't familiar, are accessory dwelling units, and they're basically in-law units, that type of thing, that are adjoined to single-family homes. And the state is passing a lot of laws recently trying to free the path for ADUs to be built to address the housing crisis in California. And so there's a lot of laws being put into place at the state level trying to clear hurdles for developers to be able to build ADUs. Those laws are mostly aimed at developer fees, so permits in order to be able to build and the development charges to build an ADU. So they're not directly affected by our study at all.
So if an ADU is built, then the fact that that's creating some share of more flow of, for the sewage plant won't be seen until the next time, the next 3-month measurement of water use, right?
So at this point in time, a single-family home is being treated as one ESSSU and is being charged a single bill. Any ADU attached to that account is not charged anymore. I've seen other agencies try to count the ADUs with varying levels of success. It's hard to argue that an ADU contributes as much water as a single-family home, so to treat it as an entirely new account is a stretch. I've actually done analysis where I've shown that homes with ADUs actually use less water than single-family homes that don't have an ADU. So there's not, with the data that we have and what we know, I would not recommend trying to charge more for ADUs at this point in time, although studies could be done.
Thank you.
Bob, you were going to add something?
I was just going to say, to the extent that the winter water use was affected by that, that would be reflected in the bill amount, but not in the base charge. It would still be one dwelling unit.
Yeah, good point. That if there is more water usage, they're paying for that.
But that'll be measured every 5 years?
Annually.
Annually?
Water is measured annually.
So every year that'll be adjusted?
It would be at the rate of $3.61 per unit. They would pay more.
All right, there was no public comment. Roll call for the city.
Councilmember Mulhern?
Yes.
Brown?
Yes.
Scalmanini?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Roscoe?
Yes.
Mayor Crane?
Aye. Your turn, sir. What are you going to do? Continue with your next meeting?
I think that we're going to have a special meeting in order to discuss and approve this, since we didn't agendize it.
Did I hear him say 2 weeks? Was that within 2 weeks?
So we'll try to have one within the next week.
Okay.
We'll take a survey on when everybody's available.
Do you agree that this is appropriate now?
I believe that that's appropriate.
All right, go ahead and adjourn your body and I'll adjourn mine.
I believe we're adjourned.
City council is adjourned.
Julie has.
Well, I wanted to hear what Tim said. He had some capital improvement discussion, and I wanted to hear it before we adjourned.
I was talked out of it. So there's, based on what the consultant said about, I contacted Ernie probably a month ago or 3 weeks ago about, when we have road projects or funding for road projects, it's nice to, consider doing the utilities as well. But I couldn't identify the exact project at this moment, so probably there's money in, there was enough leeway with what they were talking about in there to, bring a project to the board if there is one.
And again, just repeating, it's something that we should really engage in during the budgetary process and really ensure that the district and the city have the appropriate capital projects, that staff is bringing those forward for each jurisdiction to consider in a more robust way.